We're going to continue now with our introduction to Masechet Shekalim. And yesterday we began discussing the manner in which they collected the Shekalim. And we spoke about the difference between Rosh Chodesh Adar and the 15th of Adar. We'll get back to that later. We spoke about different kinds of kupos. There were kupos gedolos, kupos ktanos. Today in our introduction, we want to speak a little about the command of the Yisem Nikim. And the Gemara is going to tell us in the name of Rabbi Shmuel that both from Torah and from the Nevi'im and even from Ksuvim, we find that a person has to be Yotzei Yedei Chovaso Mikol Abrios. And the Gemara explains what that means is that a person has a special obligation to be careful that people shouldn't suspect him of something that he's not guilty of. And that's based on the pasuk, V'yisem nikiyim me'Hashem u'mi Yisrael, a pasuk in Bamidbar, Perek Lamed Beis. So therefore, the Chazal set up special laws with regard to the Gizbar, who collects the Shekalim, in order that he should be above Chashad. People should not suspect him that maybe he took some of the money and pocketed it for himself. And especially, the Gemara says that if the Gizbar all of a sudden, seems to have extra money, people start being motzi laws. Where did he get this money from? And if he goes down in his financial situation, he becomes more poor. That people are saying, "Oh, he's getting punished for taking money from the Trumas Halishka." So, in order to avoid all these chashados, the Chachamim set up an entire matrix of laws and gdarim and siagim, so that we could completely squelch this possibility that people would suspect the Gizbar might be taking money for himself. And there are special clothing that the Gizbar has to wear, special cloaks and pockets, no pockets, all sorts of isurim. And even to wear something on his head where people might suspect that he's, hiding money inside. Or, for example, he has a locket around his neck that also maybe, he was able to fit some extra money into his locket. All these are to prevent chashados. And this whole concept of Yisem Nikim is the background to who is the candidate and who would actually be accepted for this job of being the Gizbar. And there are different shiurim, different halachas about who could be the Gizbar. Now the Mishnah says later on that Eina Gizbar Torem Achu Omer Lehem Etrom Vehem Omer Lehem Trom Trom Trom. And it seems from the Mishnah that there was some sort of a dialogue, a give and take between the Gizbar and the person who came to contribute his shekel, his matzah shekel. All this is also to make sure that we remove what's called lazus fasayim, that people shouldn't be suspect. And people might say that maybe may atzmo ba l'shem l'sham l'shloch yad b'kaspei alishka. It's very important that he be invited, so to speak, or summoned to bring his shekel. Otherwise, if he comes on his own, then there are extra chashados. And the Torem shoel pamachas etrom, and he has to ask rishus to contribute. And after he asks their rishus, they respond, or the Gizbar responds, Trom, Trom, Trom. Now, what happens with the Shekalim after they were contributed? So there's a Trumas Halishka that we've mentioned more than once, with the money of which was gathered and used, dedicated, and earmarked to buy Karbonos Tmidim, the Tmidim of Shachar and Bein Arbaim on a daily basis. Also to buy the Musafim that were brought on Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, and Yotiv Moed. And together with the Karbonos Musaf, they were accompanied by Minachos and Nisachim. Now, other Karbonos Tzibur, communal obligations include the Shtei Lechem of Chag HaShavuos, the Lechem Aponim on a weekly basis, the Ktores. Then there was Melach that had to be put on the Karbonos on every single Karbon. Eitzim, they needed wood for fuel to keep the fire going. The Paraduma, the Sar Mishtaleach, even the Lashon Shel Zahuris that they tied around the neck of the Sar Mishtaleach. All this was purchased from the Trumas Halishka. What about the teachers who are hired to train the Kohen, to teach them all the halachas, Kabbalah Saddam, Zrika Saddam, to teach them how to be Mavakir Mumek Kodshim, to make sure that the animal is a Tamim and it's not a Balmum. Then there was the Sefer Torah that was used in the Azara. They had to hire a Magia, someone who was in charge of guaranteeing that the Sefer Torah was accurate. And there were Dayonik Zelos and Noshim Hargos Beparoches. All these salaries were paid from the Trumas Halishka because they were serving the Beis Hamikdash, and as such, they are public in nature. Now, what do we do with shkolim that might be surplus after we paid all the above? So the law is that if we passed Aleph Nisan, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and we still have money in the Trumas Halichka, and from that day on we begin to use the money from the Trumas Halichka for the new year. So this is called Mosar HaTruma. We discussed this or something parallel with regard to Pesach, Mosar HaPesach. You have an extra carbon Pesach. And here we have a machlokus between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shmuel about what they did, what they earmarked Mosar HaTruma for. According to the Tanakama, they used it for what's called Rikue Zahav Lebeis Kodesh and Kadosh, to beautify these tapestries that were used and they were made of gold in the Beis Kodesh Kadoshim. Rabbi Shmuel says that they were used to purchase Kli Sharis. And Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that they would buy animals for the Karbonos, which is called Kates HaMizbeach. Now, what happens if we run out of the opposite, if we don't have enough money in the Trumas Halichka? So let's say, for example, he has a case here where in the month of Teves, all the shkolim that were brought sometime around Pesach time, by the time they got to Chodesh Teves, there was nothing left because Teves is at the end of the winter. And the monies that they had brought already in Adar were completely depleted. So then there's halach of hayatorem v'chozer. There's a new hatrama. V'lokech me'ashkolim. He says we can organize a new collection and we can put that together with any surplus shkolim from last year. And they put it into a special kupa And if even that wouldn't be enough, then they would take from the Shekalim of last year, from before Pesach time. If they don't have even that amount of money, then biofen she'ozlu kol amos shenitrimu lekupos hare Yisrael chodim v'shoklim. According to Tanakama, and Rabbi Meir says, "Hayu lochim me'osam hashkolim shenitru b'lishka li'achar atruma el hakupos hagdolos shenasta b'sof chodesh adar v'kamor kriyim heim shiorei al-lishka." So this is a whole discussion about shiorei al-lishka. Now, let's just quickly review what we did yesterday at the beginning of the Gemara. The Gemara wants to know what was the whole purpose of the halacha, the requirement mentioned in the Mishnah that on the first of Adar, mashmiim al ashkolim v'al hakilayim. Lama, the Gemara asked. So the Gemara said that we need to get the shkolim be'onosam. And onosam is echad bin Nisan. So we give them a month, 30 days notice, and, be mazaris them that they should already be gathering together the money for the Beis Hamikdash. Now, why is it important that all this money be collected no later than Aleph Nisan? And the Gemara explains that on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, they would Torem the Trumas Halishka Min HaChadasha. So they began a new year as far as buying Karbonis Tzibur from this mincha, from the Truma of the Lishka Chadasha this year's Shkolim. Now, the Gemara quotes Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, and the Gemara wants to find the source for this halacha of El Aleph Nisan, that's the time for the new Trumas Halishka. And first, Rabbi Shmuel tells us Kibat Chila that it goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu, which means that it's not a Doraisa halacha. We are just trying to memorialize and immortalize, that which went on at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. And it was clear that on the day of Hakomas HaMishkan, which was Berosh Chodesh, Chodesh HaRishon B'Shon Hashem's B'Echad L'Chodesh, that's the day when they erected the Mishkan. And immediately on that day, they took the money of the Trumas Halishka and they used it to buy Karbonis Tzibur. And those were new shkolim, but that's only because there was no year behind. There was no months behind that. They didn't have a Mishkan, so they weren't collecting the shkolim for the Mishkan. And therefore, there's no way you could derive from Moshe Rabbeinu that for all Doros, we always have to start a new purchase of Karbonis HaTzibur as of Aleph Nisan. But it's nothing more than a Zecher L'Dov. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Tavi has a different opinion, and he quotes Rav Kahana to the effect that we're dealing with the Doraisa halacha based on Gzeiras Shavah. Because with regard to the Karban Musaf of Rosh Chodesh, the Torah says, Zos olas chodesh b'chodsho lechodshe hashana. So we emphasize the word lechodshe. And with regard to the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh in Parshas Bo, it says, HaChodesh hazel lechem Rosh Chodeshim rishonu lechem lechodshe hashana. Again, the word chodshe. And therefore, just like in the case of Parshas Bo, we're talking about Aleph Nisan. In Sefer Shmos, it's certainly Nisan. That's called Rosh Chadashim. And then we go back to Chodshe in the Parsha of the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. And there also it says B'Chodshe. Ein Monim Ela Min Nisan. And on Aleph Nisan, we're going to be Torem the Lichka, and we're going to bring Karbanas Tzibur from the new crop of Chadashim that was collected on Aleph Nisan. Now, what we see here in Rabbi Tavi, in the name of Rav Kahana, it's a brisa. The brisa begins with the words Nemar Kan and ends with the words Ein Monim Elam Nisan. And we're about to start the new Gemara for today, Omar Rabbi Yonah, which you'll see if you count down from the beginning of the Gemara, approximately 12, 13 lines down. And the first word of the word in the line is Nisan. And basically, Rabbi Yonah is going to point out that there's something very odd here, because when Rav Tavi quotes in the name of Rav Kahana this brisa, he actually quotes only half of the brisa. And of all things, he quotes the second half of the brisa. And Rabbi Yonah is going to argue that if you only quote the second half of the brisa, it really doesn't teach you anything. There's nothing that you could derive from the second half of the brisa. And Shavak means he cut off the head of this brisa. And Rabbi Yonah is coming to set the record straight and present the Reisha of the brisa, because to read the Seif of the brisa without the Reisha, he says, is meaningless. There's no way we can understand it. Amar Rabbi Yonah, Shavak Rabbi Tavi, Rosha de Masnisa. He completely omitted the beginning, the Reisha of this brisa. And if you talk, our problem was to derive the Truma Chadasha from the Truma Salishka on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. You can't derive it from the Reisha, from the Sefer without the Reisha. So V'Omar Sofa, notice he only gave us the Gzeira Shava of Chadshe Chadshe, but that doesn't prove exactly what we want to prove. In other words, we're talking about the Trumas Halishka of every year on Aleph Nisan. You're not going to be able to derive that from the Gzeira Shava alone. Right? The Gzeira Shava is going to tell me that Zos Olas Chodesh Bechodsho Lechodshe Ashana, the word Lechodshe, is referring to Nisan. Okay, that's fine, but it does say Chodshe. Chodshe in the plural means the months of the year. Maybe every single month of the year requires its own new Trumas Alishka for that month. Maybe every month is Machayev you a brand new purchase from the new Shekalim of that month. So on a monthly basis, we're going to have to collect the Trumas Alishka. Now it says the Lokain or Dalkain. There are two girsos here in this Yerushalmi. And we're going to learn it with the Aleph, the Lokain, and then we'll mention another interpretation of Dal Mikain. He says that the Lokain, meaning if you don't do what I tell you to do, meaning if you don't bring the beginning of the brisa, then you'll have to ask the following question: Minayin shaposik mitaber klal be'inyan zechel truma tzalishka, from the Truma Chadasha. The afilu im nomar the Truma Chadasha Iri man lema the ain torment el b'nisan dilma b'chol hachadashim nami torment. So there's a twofold question here of Rabbi Yonah. If you only had the Sefer without the Reisha, first of all, you would not know about Truma Chadasha, because again, the pasuk just says, "Zos olas chodesh bechodsho lechodshe hashana." I mean, what does that have to do with Truvas Halishka? And furthermore, even if I grant you that this pasuk will teach me Truvas Halishka in Nisan, but that doesn't mean, how do you prove that you don't collect the Truvas Halishka on a monthly basis every single month? Rabbi Yonah says, therefore, we have to bring the brisa kehada. Kehada means the entire brisa, from beginning to end, with the resha and then the sefer. So if we were writing ourselves a little note, about, to try to learn the language of the Yerushalmi, this word kahada would be on your list. Kahada means in a perfect way. Kahada, is it like this? Meaning, is it complete? And it's only complete if you bring the brisa from the top to the bottom, from A to Z, meaning from the resha down to the sefer. What is the resha of the brisa? The Tani, it says in the pasuk in Parshas Pinchas, Zos Olas Kodesh B'Chodjo L'Chodshei Hashana. Now, the Bavli at the end of Masechet Megillah on this pasuk says the following: Amra Torah Chadesh Vavei Karban Mitruma Chadasha. In other words, the Bavli says that the language here is superfluous. It says Chodesh B'Chodjo L'Chodshei Hashana. So we're going to take the word Chodesh and we're going to read it as Chadesh, meaning start something new. And the newness here is an allusion to the carbon that's taken from the Truma Chadasha. Truma Chadasha means from the brand new collection of the Shekalim. But the Brisa admits that even if the Bavli is correct and the word Chodesh here means Chadesh, so you need a new Truma Chadasha, but Yachol, I would have the ability to come to the following mistake: She'ehei Torem b'chol chodesh v'chodesh. Right, this pasuk speaks about Chodshei Hashana. So Chodshei in plural means that every single month requires its own truma chadasha from which we'll buy the korbanos for that month. So what's the machayev of truma chadasha? Is it the chodesh or is it the shana? Talmud Lomar, and here we look for the word shana in the pasuk to indicate a year. And those words are completely redundant. They don't add anything. It could have said Zos. It could have said Zos. Just 1 second. Let me read the post. Zos olas chodesh. Period. What's b'chodsho l'chodshei hashana? B'chodsho l'chodshei hashana. 3 words that are extra. And we're going to read it like this. We're going to read it when it says b'chodsho. This is the phrase that's redundant. B'chodsho l'chodshei hashana. B'chodsho is b'chodesh echad. So b'chodsho means one in the singular. And what's l'chodshei hashana? Hu torem l'chol chodshei hashana. This is the resha of the brisa. And the resha of the brisa is saying that even though you're being torem at 1 month, you're being torem for all chodshei hashana. One truma, one contribution, even though it would seem to be for 1 month, is for the entire 12 months. Oh, now we're ready for the sefer of the brisa. Okay, you've proven to me that there's a truma chadasha, and will buy the karbanis from the Truma Chadasha. You've proven to me that there's 1 month when the Truma Chadasha will establish a purchase of karbanis sibur for the entire year, l'chal chadshei hashana, but you haven't answered the most basic question. Which month is it? Can we just arbitrarily pull out, put on a talking, all the names of the months, just pull out of the bag, and whatever month it is, that's what came out of the bag. Is Yachal b'yezeh chodesh sheyirtzeh? Doesn't have to be chodesh Nisan. Oh, now we get to the Seifa and the Gzera Shava. Nemar Khan. Here in the parsha that we're learning in Pinchas, it says Chodshei, right? L'chodshei hashana. Now again, we have to add that the word Chodshei is superfluous, as we said before. Why did it have to say b'chodsho l'chodshei hashana? So the answer is Nemar lahalon. Back in Parshas Bo, it says, so it said, right? What's the pasuk again? Let's read it. And it says, Rishon hu lachem l'chodshei hashana. So it says l'chodshei hashana is ma chodshei shenemar lahalon eimonim elamid Nisan. And that we know because Moshe was standing on Nisan. In Nisan, he was saying this is going to be the first month for the entire year. Is Af Chodshei Shenemar Kan, also the word Chodshei. In the Pasuk Zos Oles Chodesh Bechodsho Lechodshei Hashana Nemar Kan Ein Monim Ela Min Nisan. So again, the reason for deriving this halacha of Torminis Halishka B'Yechad B'Nisan for the karbanos of the entire year is based on this Gzeira Shava. But the fundamental abstract principle that we have 1 month, and during that month we collect the Masa Shekel for the entire year, and we're not going to require that on a monthly basis we collect in order to use that money as Truma Chadasha for that year's worth of karbanos, the upcoming month, I should say. And that's going to be derived from the Seifa of this price of the Gzeira Shava. And the Gzeira Shava is going to teach me that you have one specific month which requires Chidush Trumas Halishka, and you can't just arbitrarily put your finger down and say, well, this is my birthday month, I'm gonna assume it's on that month. And that we know from this Gzeira Shava. My mashme'inon, the Mishnah says mashme'inon al Shekalim. Rav Huna Omar mach reason. In other words, we send out the shluchei bezdin to all the cities in Israel, and that's called mashmir. Mashmir means mach reason. They declare it. It's a public and loud declaration, so that the word will get out to all the Jews in all the cities of Israel that it's time to bring the Machzas Shekel. The Gemara is not happy with that, because if there's an annual basis for this, an annual obligation that is incumbent upon every Israelite to bring his Trumas Halichka, why do you need Achraza? Let's rely on the people that they themselves will be motivated enough to fulfill this mitzvah. You see, I think that the Gemara is a little bit inhibited about accusing Klal Yisrael that they would be lax about the mitzvah of Machzah Shekel if we didn't send out the shluchim and notify everyone. Let's say, for example, on Yudalid B'Nisan, they have to bring a Karban Pesach, every last Jew, and a Karban Chagiga. Do we find anywhere in the Mishnah that Machrizin or Mashmiim al HaKarban Pesach? Why is this truma, this campaign to raise this Hatzi shekel from each Jew? Why is that given such a special status that we need a hachraza? That beforehand we have to remind the people. Harei Yisrael me'atzmam yaviu. Let them on their own. They'll bring it, just like the Karban Pesach. So the Gemara now says that this concept of being Mizares Klal Yisrael for the Machzah Shekel dates back to the time of the Nevi'im. Ech Madiat Omar, again, one of those heavy Yerushalmi phrases. Let me just see. Second here, where did I put it down? Okay, so where I put it down. See, the language of Yerushalmi sometimes is murder. For us, we're not used to the language of Yerushalmi. Hech Madiat Omar, which somehow means that to answer your question and to teach you and prove to you that the Nevi'im already, back at the time of the Nevi'im, they were already being Mizares. It was already accepted custom that they would be Mizares Klal Yisrael to bring their Shekalim. And Hachmad Diat Omer, this is what you say, but I think it means this is what the Pasuk says. And this is a Pasuk in Divrei Yomim. It says, Vayitnu kol b'Yehuda b'Yushalayim. They let out the clarion call in Yerushalayim and in Yehuda. Lahavi Lashem, says the Pasuk. I'll read the whole Pasuk. Lahavi Lashem Masas Moshe. Masas is usually a tax. And this is a tax of Moshe. Eved Elokim Al Yisrael Bamidbar. This is the tax that was imposed by Moshe Rabbeinu on the people of Israel in the desert. And the phrase Masas Moshe is a reference to the collection of this particular tax of Shekalim, Machzah Shekel. So Moshe Rabbeinu in the Midbar already imposed this tax and collected the Machzah Shekel. And then Beis Din added something. What did they add? They required a hachraza on an annual basis. And that's codified in this pasuk, Vayitnu kol b'Yehuda b'Yushalayim lahavi Lashem Masas Moshe. Okay. Now I mentioned to you before that there was another girsa, Dal Ken, instead of the low Ken. Let me just see if I can find that girsa. Oh yeah. He says Karbana Eda, which is again one of the super commentaries here on the Yerushalmi. He has Dal Ken. Dal means to cease or terminate. Dal means lo nachon lasos ken. Lekatzer b'makom shaylo lahar. In other words, you quoted the Seifa, that wasn't a good idea. the Seifa doesn't hang in on its own without the Reish. Now, the Gemara is quoting a pasuk in Divrei Hayomim, and we're trying to figure out exactly what the Gemara wants to prove from that pasuk. We started with the words Mahu Mashmi'ina. Mashmi'ina. In other words, what is the word Mashmi'ina mean in the Mishnah? It says Bi'echad Bi'adar Mashmi'ina. And if you read the Gemara straightforward, it would sound like the Gemara is quoting a pasuk in Divrei Hayomim to tell you what the word Mashme'ina means. And it's Vayitnu Kol B'Yehuda B'Yushalayim. However, there's something called Hagos Habach, which is on this Masechet like it is on any Masechet in Shas. And he writes that this pasuk doesn't mention Shmi'ah. There's no language of Shmi'ah here. And he says that he wants to bring the Bach a different pasuk than the one that we have here from Divrei Hayomim. He wants to bring a pasuk in Nehemiah. In the 8th chapter of Nehemiah, it says, "Vasher yashmiu v'yaviru kol b'chol areim u'b'Yushalayim limor tzu'u hahar ve'viru alei zayis." And from this pasuk in Nehemiah, says the Bach, we're going to be able to derive that the word mashme'inon is hachroza or havaras kol, because the pasuk says asher yashmiu, and that's the word that our Mishnah used mashme'inon. And then it immediately says v'yaviru kol, and v'yaviru kol means hachroza. It's almost like in a positive phrase. You read it, Yashmiu, comma, V'yaviru kol. Meaning Yashmiu is Havaras kol. And this was achieved by the Shluchei Bezdin. Let's go on. Taman Tninon. Now we're going back to the first parak of Masechta Megillah. And the issue is an Ibriyah, what's called in Hebrew a Shana Muberet. So it has two Adars, right? There's the first Adar and the second Adar. And the Mishnah records that Ein Bein Adar Rishon Adar Sheni Ella Mikra Megillah Umatanos Le'evyon. So that although in a case of an Ibriyah, we can fulfill all the mitzvahs on Purim of the second month of Adar, but there are two exceptions. Now, let's talk about Matanis Levyonim. Matanis Levyonim is a package deal with Kriyas HaMegillah. Why is that so? Because classically, during the Megillah reading, that's when the Aniyim knew they could find the whole community together in the synagogue. And that's when they would put their best foot forward to collect monies. Now, I don't know if I should go around collecting money during Kriyas HaMegillah. I should pat you on the back, on the shoulder, and say, you're in the middle of hearing the Megillah. But in any event, maybe before the Megillah reading, after the Megillah reading, the whole Kehillah was there, all assembled as one congregation. That's the appropriate time, the best time to collect funds. So if the purpose of Matanis Levyonim, which requires that you be available for the Avyonim to come and collect from you, so then it depends upon Mikra Megillah. So when are we going to read the Megillah? We have two options. We have Adar Rishon or Adar Sheni. So the Mishnah says that it's Adar Sheni. So once we're going to read the Megillah on Adar Sheni, that's when Matanas Avyonim will be implemented. Because as we said, the Avyonim, Matanas Avyonim has to be attached to what? To Kriyas Megillah. But what would be, for example, if they read the Megillah mistakenly in Adar Rishon, either because they thought that there was only one Adar, or they didn't know the halachas that we postponed the Megillah reading till Adar Sheni? In those cases, Lo Yotzi Yedei Chovasa, he's going to have to read it a second time, meaning a month down the line when we get to Adar Sheni. There's no such thing as a viable Kriyas HaMegillah in Adar Rishon. Rav Simon b'Shem Rav Yeshua Levi, he interprets it af shimu ashkolim v'kilayim, that we should add something to the Mishnah. What do you mean ein ben? Ein ben, A plus B, that we have to shift from Adar Rishon to Adar Sheni. No, that's not correct. Says Rav Simon in the name of Rav Yeshua ben Levi. There are other things that have to be pushed off. To Adar Sheni. And that is Shekalim and Kilayim. Now, a bunch of the Achronim here, the Taklin Charitin, the Vishnas Eliyahu, how could it be that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is disagreeing with the Mishnah Megillah? The Mishnah Megillah says that the only difference between Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni is Kriyas HaMegillah and Evyonim. You hear the kasha? The Achronim are bothered. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is an Amor. The Mishnah is very explicit. We're only going to postpone two things from Adar Rishon to Adar Sheni. All other minhagim and mitzvahs will remain in Adar Rishon. And the two are Kriyas HaMegillah, Matanas Avyonim. Now you're coming along and you're saying, no, Hashmas Hashkolim and Kilayim is going to take place in Adar Sheni. Not true. It says Ein Ben. So I was trying to come up with an answer to this question. Maybe there's some relationship between Mikra Megillah and Mashmir al Ashkolim. Because again, we want to get the whole Kahal together. You know, the Kahal was made up of three different groups. There were those who lived in the big cities. There were those who lived in the wall cities. There were those who lived in outlying kfarim, in villages. So we want to get them all together. For what purpose? Number one, for Mikra Megillah. Number two, for Matanas Avyonim. And number three, to tell them to bring the Shekalim. No, it's not good. You didn't want to be, you wanted to be nice about it, so you didn't throw rotten tomatoes at me. We're talking about the 14th of Adar. and Mashmiim is on the first of Adar, so it can't be connected to Mikra Megillah. Now you could say perhaps that the Mashmiim al Ashkolim is only the Rabbanan. It's a Zecher L'Moshe Rabbeinu. And this Mishnah is not interested in the Rabbanans, but that's not right either, because Megillah itself is the Rabbanan. And certainly Matanas Levionin. So he says, Ulam HaRashas, I'll tell you who the Rashas is in just a minute, Bir Shedas Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Shalakach Kosev Mishnah Kan, Shebetubi Adar, Korin Es HaMegillah, Kidei Lashmienu, Shebadar, Shekorin Bo, Af Mashmiim Bo Al Ashkolim V'Kalayim. V'nimtza Shashmas Shkolim V'Kalayim, Klula, B'Mikra Megillah. So this is pretty wild. I mean, he seems to be saying what we said before, but he's insisting that it's on the 15th of Adar. I'll read it again. He says, L'kach kosev Mishnah Kan, shebetu ba'adar kohenes HaMegillah. Right? You see the second line in that Mishnah. It says, U'bechamisha sarbo kohenes HaMegillah. The Krochim. Why do we have to mention Kriyas HaMegillah? The subject of this Mishnah is Mashmiim al Ashkolim. Ma Kesher, what's it connected to? Betu B'Shvat, Betu B'Adar, Kohenes HaMegillah. He says that Kosev B'Mishnah Betu B'Adar, Kohenes HaMegillah, K'dei Lashmienu Sheb'Adar, Shekorim Bo, Af Mashmiim Bo As Ashkolim. On that Adar in which we read the Megillah, that's the month in which we're Mashmiim al Ashkolim. Why do I need you to tell me that? I already know that. I mean, the Echad Badar Mashmiim al Ashkolim. So you have to tell me that in the month that we read the Megillah, we're going to be Mashmiim al Ashkolim. It says B'Echad Badar Mashmiim al Ashkolim. The answer is, don't think that in an Ibriyar, we're going to be Mashmiim al Ashkolim in Adar Aleph. No, it's going to be the same Adar in which Kohenes HaMegillah, which is not Adar Aleph, it's Adar Beis. And the Gemara gives explanations why we postpone the Megillah to Adar Sheni. It's close to, Samchina Nisa Lenisa, it's close to the Chodesh Nisan, whatever it is over there. So in order to clarify that in an Ibriyar, you don't notify the people about the Shkolim, in Adar Aleph, he mentions that we read the Megillah, meaning that month that we read the Megillah, which in an Ibriyah would be the second Adar. And that's when we're going to be Mashmiim al Ashkolim. So this is the way he wants to reconcile Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi with our mission. Meaning that our Mishnah here at the beginning of Shekalim and the Mishnah in Megillah are one and the same. And even though the Mishnah in Megillah does not mention Mashmiim al Ashkolim, it's implicit in Kriyas HaMegillah. Because the month of Mashmas Hashkolim is the month of Kriyas HaMegillah. Which in the case of an Ibiyar is going to be Adar Sheni. Now there's a whole line and a half here in parentheses. You have that? Actually, in the Gemara itself, there are no parentheses. It just says Rabbi Chalba. There's a little dalet there. Am I right? Let me just see if I can find that dalet. No, I don't find the dalet. But in any event, in this printing that I have, he puts the entire line in parentheses, as if to say you have to omit it. And this is based on number one, the Karman Eda, the Gra, and the Taklin Charatin. Now the Rashas, so I forgot to tell you the Rashas. The Rashas was the Samach is Serleo, and he was from the Megurashe Sfarad 500 years ago and more. And he says that Hagemara Mevia Dea HaCholekes Al Yeshua ben Levi Ubir Kach Rabbi Chelbo Virav Huna, meaning Rabbi Chelbo, the name Rav Huna, and also Rav B'Shem Rabbi Chia Rabba, Hakol Biyom Arbasar, which means that everyone, even in the walled cities, are Yotze Yedei Chovasam and Kriyasam Megil Biyom Arbasar, Behu Ikar Zman Kriyasam, Fisha Ein Ma'avirin Al Mitzvahs. Lo Amr Shekorin Kamisha Sabadar Ella Im Hayu Rotzim Bekach. So in other words, there's no absolute unconditional obligation for the Bnei HaKrochim to read the Megillah on the 15th. They have the option of doing so, even though Ein Ma'avirin Al Mitzvahs, Yudalid comes before Tesvav, obviously. And therefore, on an Ibriyar, we're going to read the Megillah on Adar Rishon. Why? Because Ein Ma'avirin Al Mitzvahs. If that be the case, then we're going to be Mashmiya Al Hashkolim and on Kalayim in Adar Rishon. So this is, I think, the way he's reading this line. According to the Rash Sorleo, he's reading it Rabbi Chelba Rav Huna, meaning in the name of Rav Huna, and Rav in the name of Rav Pia Rabba. Hakol Yotzim Bar Basar Shehuzman Kriyasa. Meaning that we made a mistake if we think that the Krochim are going to read Megillah on the 15th. They do have that option, but L'chatchila, they should be reading it on the 14th because Ein Over Mal Mitzvahs. And if we're going to apply the principle of Ein Over Mal Mitzvahs vis-a-vis Kriyas Megillah, then because there's an equation between Hashmas Hashkolim and Kriyas Megillah, then in an Ibiyar, we're going to be Mashmiya al Hashkolim in the first Adar because of Ein Over Mal Mitzvahs. We're not going to wait until the second Adar. That's if you have that girsa. Rabbi Yossi v'yos, again, a typical Yerushalmi word. V'yos, meaning it's like bishlema in the Bavli, meaning it's good. Ya'ut, meaning it's nachon, it's emes v'yatz. as far as Rabbi Shua Levi, who holds that mashmiyam al hashkolim al haklayim b'echad b'adar sheni. Klum amru shemashmiyam al hashkolim. Does anybody think that when they said mashmiyam al hashkolim, they meant again, the language of the Yishalmi is a little bit tough. Let's try to get through it. Chlum amru mashmiyim al ashkolim lo kidei shiaviu Yisrael shikleim bo nosam. It's basically a rhetorical question. Meaning Rabbi Yossi is coming to tell us exactly how excited he is, and he gives his full backing to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that Mashmim al Ashkolim is on Adar Sheni, not on Adar Rishon in an Ibiyar. And why is it such a wonderful shita, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that we should postpone Mashmim al Ashkolim until the second Adar? Because what's our purpose? And he asks it as a rhetorical question. Is it not for the purpose of encouraging being Mizari's Klal Yisrael, they should bring the Shkolim be'od nosam? Imat Omar, the Adar Rishon, if in the case of an Ibriyar, you're going to make this, this declaration, send out the crews about the Shkolim. In Adar Rishon is Ad Kidon. How much are we left with the shot of this year? Until they're going to actually have to, the deadline for the Shkolim, which is Aleph B'Nisan, is Shata Shitin Yomin, 60 days. The old year, as far as Shkolim are concerned, still has another 60 days. So you're notifying a person 60 days in advance of a mitzvah that he's obligated. Adayin yesh b'shana yotzei shichim yom. From Aleph Adar Rishon until Aleph Nisan is 60 days. And if you're going to give achroza, who's going to remember, 60 days later what you heard? Plum amru v'yotzin af al hakilayim. So in other words, in addition to the achroza of Aleph Adar, the shlichim have to also come back for Kalayim. Lo kadesh yu atzmochem nikarim. Again, I think he's asking it as a rhetorical question. The whole purpose of being mashmi on Kalayim is to notify them when they have tzmochem nikarim that they should pull out the Kalayim. Imata omer b'adar rishon. Is kidon inun dakikin. Dakikin means very small. So the growth is not mature. They can't see if there's kalayim. It's only later on when it really shoots out. So the Iber Shana, in which we add an extra Adar, is in order to extend the winter another month and start the spring later. That's why we wedged another Adar there between either Aleph and Nisan. And during the winter months, the plants that you grew are not yet grown. Maybe they're still cold and is therefore Yafa Amar Rabbi Shimon Levi Shashmos Hashkolim V'Akilayim He B'Adar Sheni. And the pattern is very simple. Adar Rishon is too early. It's too early to be Mashbiah al Hashkolim because they have 60 days until the new Truma Kadosha the Trumas Halishka of Aleph Nisan, and it's too early to notify the farmers that they have to pull out the Kilayim, because at this stage, with regard, because again, the purpose of Ibr Shana is to align the solar and lunar calendars, and the solar calendar, since it's off vis-a-vis the lunar calendar, that's what's going to determine the Gidol HaPeros. And when there's Gidol HaPeros, that's why we want to zap them and remind them, get rid of your Kilayim. And in a case where there's an Adar Sheni, obviously what we did was, in order to align the difference between the lunar and solar calendars, we added a month so that the winter would be pushed forward, and that Chodesh Aviv, would be appropriate for Pesach. And if the winter is schlepping along, and how much of the growth are they going to see in their gardens and in their fields, such that now we can, in a meaningful way, warn them about Kilayim. It's too early to warn them about Kilayim. Okay, Rabbi, say this is where we got up to for today. Rabbi Chizkiah Sha'al, note of it, towards the bottom of Daf Beis Amud Aleph.